how to breathe life into cities, and landscape urbanism is certainly one of the approaches that has come out in like the late 1900s. So we're going to look at it today from a number of, three different things. We're going to look at it, at the context of it. We're going to look at the kind of theories that are involved in it, and then we're going to look at James Horner, and then we're going to look at some examples of projects that have been identified as landscape urbanist projects. So Charles Waldheim is one of the kind of key figures. There are a number of people who are the voice of landscape urbanism. James Horner is one of them. Charles Waldheim was one of his students at the University of Pennsylvania. And it is sometimes a little complicated to understand, but in a nutshell, Waldheim says it's a system in which landscape replaces architecture as the basic building block of contemporary urbanism. So those are kind of the key ideas. The landscape is going to be the building block of the contemporary city. So it's an expanded field of urban design of which landscape is at the center. And it's less about what it looks like and more about what it does, how it's going to function, how it's going to function over time. So some of the context of landscape urbanism, why did this come about? One is the global trend towards urbanization. So currently, 50% of the world's population is in urban areas. There is a continuing migration from rural areas to urban areas. And it's estimated that in the next 40 years, 2/3 of the world's population is going to live in urban areas. So cities are expanding. The battle for sustainability, the battle for quality of life is going to be fought in an increasingly urban world. So we talked about some of these ideas when I discussed postmodernism, about getting away from authority, moving more towards diversity, multi-perspectives on things, grassroots. And landscape urbanism fits into that kind of field of thinking as well. This is a time when we're moving away from the thought that everything is static and everything is in equilibrium to everything becoming more fluid, more changeable, so that systems are no longer closed, they're thought of as open. It's no longer about linear systems, it's about networked systems. So there's this change from the very predictable to the unpredictable, from the stable to the unstable. And so contemporary cities are in flux. They're part of that non-equilibrium, unstable, uncertainty component of the world. Another part of the context is the emergence of environmental planning. So today's the anniversary of Earth Day. Happy Earth Day, everybody. And this is kind of an event where people at an international level began to pay attention to environmental issues, acknowledge and mark the importance of environmentalism. Ian McHarg was a landscape architect who developed a system of being able to kind of predict in certain ways the patterns of environmental planning. How should land be used? Where should it be used? Where should it be protected? So he's a landscape architect, but he is encouraging landscape architects to be environmentalists, and he encouraged landscape architects to think regionally, to think on a much larger scale than just the small site. So he's really bridging the gap between design and planning, embracing a lot of different scales from garden design up to the region. His book, in which he talked about this and you know, mapped a lot of this, I'm going to show you some of the maps from the book, had a lot of appeal to the general public. It actually, you know, had readers outside of the profession of landscape architecture and was a finalist for the National Book Award. So his work was really important. He actually had a TV program in which he interviewed people or talked to people about the environment as well. So he had kind of a public presence outside of the profession. So he wanted to develop these systematic ways of analyzing and designing. And he would look at natural systems, he would look at cultural systems, and he created this overlay system. This is back before computers, right? This book came out in 1969. This illustration here is from his book. He physically and manually drew maps, and he would draw maps of different site conditions, different landscape conditions on transparent material. And then he would lay them all on top of each other and look at the different layers and how they interacted, and then make decisions about which areas were most suited for what kinds of needs. So this is kind of a painstaking process. It is definitely the forerunner of GIS. You know, not all of that would be done in computers, but he really popularized this kind of system of overlays, and then he would look for what he called intrinsic suitability, meaning what areas are intrinsically suitable for what kind of land uses. So here he did a study of Staten Island, and he looked at existing land use, existing vegetation, forest ecological associations, beaches, hydrology. He's looking at all of this stuff, and he layers it on top of each other, and then he comes up with a value system. So it assumes that you're going to value certain kinds of features, certain kinds of potential futures for the site, certain kinds of suitabilities based on those site conditions. So, you know, layering them all together and then deciding what areas are best for recreation, what areas are best for ecology, you know, giving them a scale and rating those based on a value system. So through the data inventory and then assessing it and then making decisions based on that value system. This is also a time when ecologists are beginning to think about urban sustainability. Not as, you know, what is the kind of little bits of ecology within a city, but rather the ecology of the entire city. So that the urban system could be part of a larger ecology. So this is coming from the field of science and ecology, and they start to look at spatial organizations and the dynamics of the system, and putting these together into the framework of sustainability with ecology and how the landscapes function. But they're looking at multifunctional landscapes. They're looking at the city, and they're looking at the ecology of the city, rather than just little components of ecology found within the city. This is also a time when people are paying attention to infrastructure issues, highways, airports, shopping centers, residential developments, shopping malls. All of these are part of urban industrialized areas. So all of this infrastructure becomes part of the landscape. It's at a huge scale, a vast scale, an ecological scale, a regional scale. And so the renovated industrial cities will have these components in it that don't need to be camouflaged, right? They are part of the city, they are part of the post-industrial city. So the idea of landscape urbanism emerges first with James Corner, who coins the phrase landscape as urbanism, and then his student, Charles Waldheim, who refines it, shortens it to landscape urbanism. So all this happens in the 1990s. And they're thinking about it as interdisciplinary. The people who are responding to the idea of landscape urbanism are also interdisciplinary. And so it's not just architects or landscape architects, but there's a lot of other disciplines that become engaged in the idea of landscape urbanism. Urban designers, ecologists, and so there's a lot of conversation about the topic, a lot of theory about the topic. The chapter that you read today is actually from the Landscape Urbanism Reader, which was edited by Charles Waldheim. So the theory is based on the idea that landscape replaces architecture in the city. And landscape becomes the building block for urban design. It looks at processes related to the landscape. And these processes could be water systems, they could be biodiversity, urban agriculture, vegetation, ecological patches and corridors. A lot of different systems that are part of the process of landscape that you can bring to the urban areas. But it's no longer about built form. It's the landscape that's going to organize it. So this can change, this can adapt, this can respond to succession, it can be in flux, but it is about a process, not about a fixed, built form. So in a lot of ways, the landscape urbanism requires that the designer or the planner sort of steers change, sets into motion what kind of changes are going to happen on the landscape, and organizes the horizontal surface of the landscape, creates some kind of configuration for what's going to happen on the landscape. The theory is a response to what they see as the failures of 20th century modernism, like urban renewal, or 20th century design like new urbanism, where the built form is what is most important. So they see these approaches to design as having shortcomings, and they use urban renewal and new urbanism as kind of evidence that form alone can't remedy the problem of cities. That you have to have a larger landscape perspective, that you have to think kind of parallel with ecology at multiple scales. The neighborhood, the city, the region, all of those have to work together, and you have to think about a process over time. You have to think about change and uncertainty. So they're definitely responding to the kinds of urban design that have come out of historical time periods where there is attention to static compositions, because they think the landscape should not be static, it should be in flux. The theory of landscape urbanism rejects the opposition of nature and the city. And we've seen this kind of good nature, bad city formula in designs like Central Park, in the thinking of Frederick Law Olmsted, in Jens Jensen's designs for places like Columbus Park in Chicago. So landscape urbanists reject this opposition. They think that you shouldn't try to camouflage ecological systems within the city. You shouldn't try to create pastoral images of nature within the city, but that the city should look like the city, and the landscape in the city can reflect that as well. Drawscape, the idea of waste landscapes or kind of in-between landscapes are also an important component of landscape urbanism. So there was a book that came out a few years ago by Alan Berger called Drawscapes, in which he gives these startling aerial photographs and these brilliant kind of hard-to-read diagrams of the kind of leftover industrial spaces. And in this case, it's outside of Atlanta, the infrastructure that's been abandoned when industry left Atlanta. But there's also the landscapes of new development, the kind of sprawl that happens around new urban areas or ex-urban areas. And so looking at these kind of in-between areas, the places of production or post-industrial abandonment, and using them as part of the spaces that are worthy of attention and should get some attention paid to them in the kind of landscape urbanist approach to urban design and planning. So Drawscape is the word that was coined to talk about these kind of leftover spaces, these abandoned spaces, or these kind of waste spaces of urban areas that are marginal outside of the center. So I started with this quote from Waldheim in terms of kind of the basic definition of landscape replacing architecture, but there's a couple other things in here that he's saying in this quote. One is that landscape urbanism is a cross-range discipline. So they're very interested in a kind of hybrid profession or in multidisciplinary teams where there's a lot of different fields that are coming together, layering different ideas together, bringing together different kinds of knowledge and working together on these projects. The other thing that he's saying is that landscape urbanism is a lens through which the city is viewed. So it's a way of looking at the city, of reconceptualizing the city, looking at it in a new way. And it's also the medium through which it is constructed. So one, you're going to look at it differently, and two, you're going to make changes to it differently based on landscape urbanism. So it's a position of both, it's a framework for looking at it, but it's also a framework for reconceiving how it should be developed. So, you read James Corner for today, and Waldheim was one of his students, the guy who we just looked at his quote, and he's very influenced by Corner. They worked collaboratively on the idea of developing the idea of landscape urbanism. Corner is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's also the principal of the design firm Field Operations. And so we'll be looking at a lot of his work. So he's both a theorist and a practitioner. And he proposes these open-ended strategies of landscape urbanism which integrate environmental systems and man-made systems. And we'll see that in his design work. So what you read for today, the article Terra Fluxus, proposes 4 themes for landscape urbanism. So the idea of process over time is derived from ecology, and it proposes a more dynamic, more fluid kind of urbanism. And Corner proposes that process is more significant in shaping urban relationships than the spatial forms of urbanism are in and of themselves. So rather than the spatial forms of urbanism, it's the process that is the most significant part of shaping the landscape. So he's talking about ecological processes here in one of his proposals for a competition. He's looking at how ecology can change over time and over space. So he's he's really moving away from the fixed deterministic models of urbanism. And so the city itself should start to emulate the natural system. To do that, the medium, the basis for that should be the landscape. It's not about the buildings, it's about the horizontal plane. Right? This is the field of action. And it can be the ground plane, it can be rooftops, anything that's horizontal, a wide range of scales from sidewalks to an entire metropolis. He suggests, for instance, that the grid is a great system for setting up potential for choreographing possibilities. He talks about the land survey of the Western U.S. as laying out this grid, and then what happens within that grid is determined over time by different users. So it's an infrastructure for stimulus, for design, for planning, but it doesn't dictate what happens within those squares. So somebody can have a field, or they can have a house, they can have a small garden, there can be a cluster of houses. It just sets up this framework, and then whatever future takes place within there isn't dictated by that framework. He talks about working methods. How do you make this happen? How does landscape urbanism get accomplished? How do these new cities get manifested? And it's very complex. These proposals, a wide range of scales, things changing over time, means that there needs to be a lot of different people engaged in the process, a lot of different actors, a lot of different professions. And he also calls for new methods, new ways of thinking, new ways of representing the project. So it might be drawings, it might be choreography, it might be computers, it might be math, whatever it takes to represent and to conceptualize these projects. So it's kind of challenging the existing working methods that people have been using historically for planning and design, to think about differences in scale, to think about a multitude of professions and disciplines engaged in multiple ways of representing the projects. And finally, his kind of big call is for the imaginary. And really all of these, in some ways, are the same thing. It's hard to kind of split the imaginary from working methods. But he's saying that in order to create a landscape urbanism project, you have to think in a very imaginary way. So, how you come up with solutions, how you create possibilities, all of this has to be open to rethinking and reimagining. So rather than using traditional disciplinary ways of looking at it, this is kind of a call to think differently, to think large, to think about the possibilities that a project has to offer, sort of reinvent those possibilities. So now we're going to look at some projects to see how they live up to the landscape urbanist criteria. And we'll see in these projects that a lot of them deal with infrastructure or deal with actually dross space, de-industrialized space, looking at ecology, systems, process, and use of outdoor space. These tend to be parks in kind of post-industrial sites. A project that's been celebrated as part of the landscape urbanist literature is Parc de la Villette in Paris, kind of on the outer edge of Paris in a more working class neighborhood. It was a 125-acre site that was a brownfield. It was a slaughterhouse until the 20th century. And so they wanted to convert this former slaughterhouse site into a park for the 21st century. That's what was kind of the call for the agenda, and they had a competition, they staged a competition for submissions for that park for the 21st century. Now this was not a landscape urbanist project, and the people who submitted entries, this actually predates the emergence of landscape urbanism. The competition was in 1985, so it's really before any of this was even coined. But it is still a project that landscape urbanists use to talk about some of the issues related to landscape urbanism. So a working class neighborhood surrounded by residential areas, very much a part of the city and part of its infrastructure. Schumi identifies this as a deconstruction project, a deconstructivist project, and I will talk about that more on Thursday, about deconstruction. But this design nonetheless offers some things to think about in terms of landscape urbanism. So he proposed a system of 3 levels, the planes, the points, and the lines, and they are laid one on top of each other without any real relationship to one another. So the lines tends to be the path systems, the planes tend to be the horizontal surfaces, and the points are little red structures. So this kind of prepares the field for however people want to use it. It allows for unprogrammed activities. It's basically a open-ended, non-hierarchical site. The use of the space is very flexible. So it has this horizontal field of various levels of green space and paving, accommodates all kinds of urban activity, called planned activities and unplanned activities, imagined, unimagined activities that could change over time. And part of this is made possible by these points. So the points are little structures laid out on a grid in the park, and they don't have any particular program to them. So they're largely unprogrammed structures, and allow people to act in these spaces, allow people to act on these structures in unprogrammed ways. So a lot of this has to do with some kind of deep French philosophies on performance and performative theory and deconstruction, but landscape urbanists look at this and say, he created this field, this non-hierarchical field of follies, these structures, these red structures that people can use in any way they want, and the uses can change over time. So the other thing that these structures do is it weaves together the city and the park, the city and the landscape. So there is green space, there's open space, there's trees, but there are structures. It's like the grid of the city is extended into the park. It doesn't pretend to be pastoral, it doesn't pretend to be countryside. It is definitely urban in its structure. So James Corner, who you read for today, was one of the principal designers in the High Line project in New York City, and I'm curious how many people have been to the High Line. Good, great. So it's an elevated rail that has been turned into a park. Two parts of it have been opened by now. There's a third part yet to be opened. And it was a completely abandoned railroad site. So it was elevated, you can see here in its former state, and then it was left to natural processes. Plants volunteered, right? The seeds got blown in. It created a kind of ecology of volunteer plants within the elevated rail site. And there was kind of spontaneous urban succession happening in place. And then people thought it would make a great park. And as part of that park, James Corner Field Operations was interested in continuing the idea of succession, of spontaneous urban succession. So they created a framework that could accommodate change. So these plants can change, they can diversify over time. Here's an illustration where they're looking at succession from the grasslands to tree cover over time. So ecological systems of biodiversity and natural succession actually can take place. They have set up the possibility for it to take place, and then it's up to ecological systems to take over and accommodate or respond to the system over time. There are also social and cultural and economic components to this system as well. You know, social places, place to hang out, history. The history of the site is embedded in the landscape. The rails have been very carefully removed and very carefully put back into the place, and the history of the site is still evident. This is an old industrial structure, and they removed the glass was probably no longer there, but they replaced it with an artist's work, and the artist created these panes of glass that are the colors of the Hudson River. So she created a kind of like pixels per inch of what the Hudson River might look like at certain times of the day. And it's also an engine for economic development, for better or worse. It has really been a stimulus for redevelopment for this particular neighborhood. Built on a brownfield. You know, this is an urban, a marginalized urban, deindustrialized landscape that has been recycled as a project that then can bring ecology, social and cultural and economic growth to the city. It sort of blurs the line between what is landscape and what is city. You know, it still has a very good form, but the ecology is made visible. So the next part that I'm going to talk about is the Duesburg Nord Park. And it's part of a much larger project for the Ruhr district of Germany, which is kind of like a giant brownfields project with severe post-industrial decline in a river valley in Germany. And there was a national project to reinvigorate this entire region, a redevelopment plan that included structures, it included restoration of rivers, it included greenway systems, and also looking at the industrial heritage as part of it. So a lot of different systems were layered into this with the goal of urban development, with the goal of social and cultural and ecological interventions that would then be an impetus for economic change. So the Ruhr District was at one time a great powerhouse economically, industrially. You know, it had some periods of boom and bust. It had originally been a region that was used for mining coal for industries and then for iron and steel production. And those businesses collapsed in the 20th century due to a lot of the businesses leaving the country, a lot of the steel production going elsewhere, international competition for the production of steel, and because their coal was depleted. So the region economically collapsed. There's a lot of industrial sites, open sewers, because you know, this was built at a time when wastes were just dumped into the river, a lot of railroad lines, and there was, of course, still the river corridors that were very polluted, but still a part of this system. So a lot of industries were left behind, industrial structures that were abandoned, a lot of contaminated lands and water, and basically a region that was kind of biologically dead. So the goals of the redevelopment, as I said, were to build the ecology of this site, along with understanding the industrial past and bringing economic redevelopment to the region. So here you can see what the river looked like prior to the restoration project and then afterwards. This was a 10-year project, so it was a long-term redevelopment plan. It involved 17 cities, 4 different administrative regions, so it was a very, very complex project and involved private companies and local governments, and so very, very complicated with a lot of really small projects, 100 little projects stretched up throughout the region. So we're going to look specifically at the Duisburg Nord, which was in the city of Duisburg, and it was almost a 600-acre site within the Emscher River watershed. Industrial, yes. Had been a closed smelting works at one time. So polluted, brown fields, a lot of contamination in the soils and from the site into the river. But the idea of this design of this project was that if you keep the scars of the land present, it doesn't necessarily have to be an unattractive or depressing place. Right? You can use that industrial history as a way of showing evidence of the past, of showing what this region used to be like, including all the bad stuff like the destruction of the landscape, the exhaustion of the resources, but still, people can come here and feel what this place was like at one time. So incorporating those industrial relics was an important part of the landscape plan, and not looking to these kind of 18th century naturalistic design vocabularies for what a park might look like. So the pedestrian corridors are part of the old industrial landscape. The railroad lines are now used for humans to travel along. This was a park that, like the High Line, had volunteer plants that had seeded in, so succession had already become part of the park even before it was a park, but when it was an abandoned industrial site. And so that idea of succession was continued and reused as part of the idea of the Duisburg Nord Park. Different industrial features have been incorporated in, so they're not trying to hide the industrial class, but rather to use memory as an important component of the landscape, whether it's using structures for climbing structures or for small intimate gardens. and they're using those components as part of the park design. So, the Hampshire project works on a number of different scales, from the huge regional scale down to the very small scale of design. So, for instance, this plaza in which metal plates from the old industrial history are used to create a plaza in the park. So there's really a relationship between the large-scale infrastructure and the small-scale material conditions, being celebrated and exhibited here as part of the design. And water was also an important consideration, right? This is part of this river corridor. And so the old structures, in this case cooling towers, were used to create biofilters for water. There's different stages where these former cooling towers now become ways of cleaning and filtering the water before it gets released into the river. But again, no attempt to camouflage the industrial history, but rather to use it as a part of the park's design vocabulary. So Fresh Kills on Staten Island is probably the world's largest landfill. That's kind of one of their claims to fame, which makes it probably one of the hugest man-made single objects on the planet Earth. It was a landfill site for New York City from the mid-1900s to the early 2000s, and then it was reopened after 9/11 to accept the debris from the World Trade Center towers. They had a park competition to create what would be the largest park in New York City. This park is about 3 times the size of Central Park, 2,200 acres, so it's a large site. The scale is big. The competition, the winning competition entry was by James Corner, Field Operations, and they called their design Lifescape. And a lot of the components of landscape urbanism were at play here: multidisciplinary design team, the landscape viewed as process. So here you can see they're presenting the landscape in layers, both in terms of this much is its history, the site history, and these are the proposed new interventions of habitat pathways and program spaces. But this is a long-term strategy, setting something into motion and then letting it take place over time, and representation, that, rethinking the methods of presenting this project to the public. How should the actual drawings look is part of the mode of operation of James Corner and his firm. So there's a fluid interchange between environmental systems and the human systems that are going to be added as well, the pathways, in order to restore cultural life to this area, right? Not just ecological life, but cultural activities as well. So dynamics are really fundamental to this scheme, and this shows you their phasing. The first phase is they're just seeding, putting in the beginning seeds of change. And then they're going to intervene with infrastructure and then programming changes. And then in phase 4, these components will adapt over time. Kind of the process is set in place. Eventually, it's left on its own. The habitat, the successional planting, the hydrological systems, they're left to create their own path once the framework has been set up by this project. And so the goals include ecology, they include human use, they include recreation as part of the programming of the site. there's recreation, there's markets, there's educational components like living classrooms, outdoors. So all of this is part of the systems of this particular project. So this gives you an idea of their thinking about phasing related to plant life and habitat. You know, what's going to happen over multiple years in terms of the grasslands, the woodlands, the lowland forests. So there's a role here for uncertainty, right? The role for networks and connectivity, setting it all into motion. It's really complex, interwoven. Cities' components are being set into place, natural systems and social systems and the infrastructure systems are all just being set into place. Then they can have an indeterminate future, right? They're guessing at what the future is going to look like, but it is not going to be dictated by the designers. So their representations include cross-sections. You know, how are those changes going to look over time in terms of cross-sections? You know, 0 to 5 years, 15 to 30 years. What is the land in section going to look like? You know, how is the habitat changes going to occur across that landscape? So they're not just looking at time; they're also looking at place. You know, land form. Low-lying areas, higher areas, you know, how will those areas change over time? And this was a huge project with a team of consultants that the scale of this project demanded. You know, environmental planners, ecologists, financial planning, bird ecologists, plant ecologists, you know, a huge range of different professions to bring together the kind of intersection of these different fields of water, of energy, of ecological systems, of recreation, of process over time. You know, it required a lot of disciplines working together on this final project. Landfill experts, right? What's going to happen to this landfill over time? And as I mentioned earlier, representation was an important component of this. You know, rethinking methods for presenting the project or how to imagine the project. So a wide range of analysis and representational methods, right? So cross sections and these were illustrations for the project as well. You know, helping people to envision what this project might look like in the future. So here they're trying to stimulate realism as opposed to these other more diagrammatic approaches in order to allow people to visualize what these elements might look like in the future. So there have been criticisms of landscape urbanism. One of them is about this issue of representation. That, you know, so the landscape urbanists believe that if you're going to create an uncertain future, you're creating these future possibilities, how do you represent them? You know, it's not really designing, you're allowing changes, how do you illustrate these changes? So some people find these graphics a little too abstract, and some people think that landscape urbanists are just too focused on representation. That, you know, a lot of the projects we know from competition entries, and these competition entries are really based on the illustrations, you know, how these projects are represented. So the emphasis has been a lot on representation until the projects can get built, so we actually walk through more of these landscapes and see how they function over long periods of time. But right now, the emphasis is really on the representation. So the other criticisms of landscape urbanism is that it may be, you know, skirts around too superficially the idea of ecology. It's kind of wearing it more as as a badge rather than really digging deeply into it. They're not necessarily talking about sustainability in a bigger sense, but about the ecology of the site. And the other criticism is that they focus on the design professions, that a lot of these projects are architects, urban designers, landscape architects working together rather than reaching out to other fields outside of the design profession. There's also criticisms of the language, that it's, the discourse is a little complicated and a little theoretical. You might have found that in reading James Corner's piece. I actually have, if you do find it complicated and you would like somebody to kind of burst that balloon, on the back of this is a website where you can ask it to generate phrases, landscape urbanist phrases, and they give you these 3-word phrases, and so these are some of the phrases that I got it to generate. So they're just kind of like random verb, adjective, noun that they put together that I believe probably come at some point in time from different landscape urbanist texts. So there is criticism of the kind of emphasis on theory that people find a little off-putting for landscape urbanism. There's also been, in the past couple of years, a sort of street fight between Andreas Duani, who designed Seaside, and Charles Waldheim, one of the voices for landscape urbanism, about the importance of urban form versus the importance of process. And Waldheim believes that urban form has been a failure, and that they don't like the kind of retro-romantic architectural vocabulary of new urbanists. And yet new urbanists believe that the importance of urban areas is to make them walkable communities. And they can't be walkable if it's all about the ecological systems. That in order to make it walkable, you have to have a street and you have to have density. So the landscape urbanist projects tend to be large parks, at least that's where the competitions have been, rather than walkable neighborhoods. So we've yet to see how landscape urbanists might play out their vocabulary in a more dense new urbanist setting. But Andreas Duani, who designed Seaside, said that one of the problems is that landscape urbanists, because they value ecology so much, will not put water into pipes. And if you don't put water underground into pipes, then you can't have walkable cities like New York. All the water in New York City is underground. So once you start revealing water, you start revealing the ecology, you spread things out, and so the new urbanists think of landscape urbanists as sprawl dressed in green. That this is a new kind of sprawl. You're really, you're emphasizing the ecology and the landscape. You're really spreading things out beyond the urban centers into the metro regions and not making dense, walkable cities. So there is this kind of cat fight between the two disciplines. All right.
So if there's an ecology on the site, say on the river, as the river passes through the landfill site, what about way upriver where there's also just going down, think about what's upriver, just where they're at.
That project was a huge regional project. So it did, it wasn't just the Emscher in the Duisburg area. It really looked at the whole